Have you ever tried explaining yourself to someone who already made up their mind? You spoke with care. You reached for clarity. You even softened your words so they wouldn't sound like blame. And still, they looked at you like a stranger. Or worse, they twisted your honesty into an accusation, and suddenly you weren't defending your actions. You were defending your right to feel. That's not miscommunication, that's emotional erosion. And the more you try to explain yourself in those dynamics, the more you lose the part of you that knows it's sane. Nietzsche didn't argue with that kind of silence. He didn't plead for understanding from people who fed off distortion. He warned, sometimes people don't want to hear the truth because they don't want their illusions destroyed. And when you realize that the person in front of you isn't seeking truth, they're seeking dominance, that's the moment you stop explaining and start leaving, because nothing you say will ever be heard by someone who's using your words to build the case against you. So you don't raise your voice, you don't repeat yourself, you don't argue, you walk away, cold, clear, done. The trap of explaining yourself. There is a specific kind of silence that follows the moment you realize your words no longer matter. Not because they weren't true, but because they were never meant to be heard. You explained yourself. Slowly, patiently, carefully. You made your feelings smaller, your voice softer, your truth easier to digest, and still, you were met with blank stares or worse, sharpened smiles that turned your honesty into ammunition. This isn't miscommunication, it's extraction, a slow, quiet theft of your self-trust, disguised as dialogue. And the more you try to explain, the more invisible you become. Nietzsche never wasted his breath on distortion. He understood. Sometimes people don't want to hear the truth because they don't want their illusions destroyed. You are not misunderstood. You are inconvenient to their illusion. That's why they interrupt, why they deflect, why they pretend not to understand what you said with perfect clarity. Because if they acknowledged your words, they would have to change, and they have no intention of changing. So they make you question the way you said it, the timing, the tone, the fact that you said anything at all. And little by little, you stop speaking to be understood. You start speaking to avoid punishment. Explaining yourself becomes a form of self-protection, not from danger, but from being labeled difficult, dramatic, or cold. This isn't about connection, it's about conditioning. You've been trained to see your truth as a threat to the peace, but peace that requires your silence is not peace, it's imprisonment. Nietzsche didn't trim himself to fit into fragile rooms. He walked out not to prove a point, but because truth, once bent too many times, loses its spine, and once your truth collapses, so do you. That's why they keep asking for explanations, not to understand, to reshape your motives, your identity, your entire sense of reality. And the longer you stay, the more you forget what it sounds like to trust your voice without first checking if it offends them. You begin to speak like a hostage, soft, neutral, unthreatening. You apologize for your tone, you downplay your pain, you edit your truth until it's unrecognizable to yourself. Jung would call this the erosion of self. Nietzsche called it surrender, because every explanation delivered to the wrong person is not a bridge, it's a leash, and you are the one holding both ends. When someone truly values you, they don't make you earn the right to be believed. They don't turn your vulnerability into a courtroom cross-examination. They listen, they soften, they stay open. But manipulators don't seek truth. They seek leverage. And every word you offer becomes another tool to sharpen their control. So stop explaining, not because you have nothing to say, but because your words deserve ears that don't twist them. Some people don't misunderstand you. They rely on the misunderstanding to keep you in a state of emotional defense. Because as long as you're explaining, you're not leaving. And as long as you're not leaving, they remain untouched. Nietzsche didn't argue, he excited. Because truth doesn't scream, it walks quietly, finally, without looking back. The door you close behind you is not abandonment, it is self-rescue, and the silence that follows it is not a punishment, it's clarity sharpened into liberation. Misunderstanding is rarely an accident, it's a tool, a strategy, a mask that pretends to be confusion while quietly tightening its grip around your clarity. You think if you just explain better, speak softer. Slow it down, simplify, they'll finally understand, but they don't want to understand because understanding would force them to take responsibility, and responsibility means losing control. So instead, they interrupt, they spin, they cherry-pick your words and frame you as emotional, manipulative, too intense. And just like that, your truth is no longer truth. It's evidence. Evidence they use to turn the conversation into a courtroom and you into the defendant. But the verdict was written before you even opened your mouth. Nietzsche saw this long before modern psychology named it. All things are subject to interpretation. Whichever interpretation prevails at a given time is a function of power and not truth. This isn't about what you said, it's about who gets to define what it means. And in their hands, your meaning is always distorted, because that distortion keeps you busy. Busy trying to rephrase, trying to calm them down, trying to justify how you feel without sounding difficult. It keeps you spinning, not grounded, defensive, not clear, apologetic, not free. You become the translator of your own pain in a language they never intend to learn, because if they understood you, they'd lose their grip on you. And some people need confusion to maintain control, so they create fog. They deny what they said yesterday. They mock the seriousness of your boundaries. They act offended that you even brought it up. And if you respond too calmly, you're calculating. If you respond too emotionally, you're unstable. If you don't respond at all, you're stonewalling. This is not communication. This is psychological war disguised as discussion. They don't want to understand you. They want to exhaust you until you stop trying. And when you stop, when you finally say, it's not worth it anymore, they call you the quitter, the cold one, the one who couldn't handle conflict. And the worst part? You almost believe them because you've been trained to see their confusion as a signal to try harder. But Nietzsche knew better. He who fights with monsters should see to it that he himself does not become a monster. And when you keep defending yourself to someone who doesn't care, that's exactly what happens. You twist, you contort. You become unrecognizable even to yourself. That's the point. They win not by defeating your logic, but by draining your will to speak it. Because once you're tired enough, you'll give them what they wanted all along. Silence, but not the silence that protects you, the silence that submits. So they can say, see, you're finally being reasonable. And this is the moment Nietzsche would have left. Not to avoid conflict, but to preserve self. Because when people need you to explain your worth before they'll treat you with dignity, they're not confused. They're controlling the terms of your existence. And some rooms are so toxic that the only way to win is to disappear, not out of fear, but out of final clarity. No grand goodbye, no emotional essay. Just the quiet withdrawal of your truth from a place that was never designed to hold it. You stop replying, you stop clarifying, you stop proving that you're allowed to feel what you feel. And in the absence of that performance, you recover something sacred, your command. Because clarity is not proven through repetition. It's revealed in what you refuse to keep explaining. Let them misinterpret, let them rewrite the narrative, let them call your silence immature. You don't need their understanding to validate your knowing, and if they needed to be confused to feel powerful, then your clarity is not something they lost, it's something they feared, and that's why they tried to destroy it. There's a type of exhaustion that doesn't show in your eyes. It lives in your sentences, in the way you repeat the same truth, hoping this time it lands where it belongs. But it never does, because they're not confused, they're in control. Every time you defend yourself, you give away something sacred. Not just your peace, your position, Your very place in the story shifts from person to proof, from human to defendant. You think you're clarifying, but you're shrinking. You think you're setting things right, but really, you're erasing yourself, word by word, pause by pause. You're not explaining, you're translating your pain into a language designed to dismiss it. Nietzsche didn't participate in that theater. He saw the trap. The moment you argue your essence, you've already surrendered the authority of it. He said, whoever despises himself still respects himself as one who despises. But this isn't even self-hatred, it's self-abandonment, and they love it, because once you're explaining, you're engaged, and once you're engaged, they have time to twist, to flip, to deny, to smile while pretending your wounds don't exist. This is not a conversation, it's choreography, designed to wear you down until you forget what your truth even sounded like before it had to pass through their filters. And slowly, you begin to perform, not because you're fake, but because you've been made to believe your truth, unedited, is too much. So you speak in measured tones. You speak like someone applying for mercy. You speak like someone who's not allowed to feel, and still, they call you unreasonable. This is the madness. They provoke you, then call you emotional. They gaslight you, then call you confusing. They ignore you, then call you distant. And if you defend yourself, they say you're overreacting. So what's left? Silence, not out of defeat, but out of something higher, the refusal to keep proving what was always true. When you disappear, you're not punishing them. You are interrupting the transaction. You are saying, my piece is no longer for sale. And that's when something sacred returns, your form, your spine, your voice, no longer trimmed for their comfort. Because the moment you stop explaining, you start remembering. Your soul was never up for debate. And your clarity? It doesn't need approval, it needs a door, closed, locked, walked through. Let them misunderstand, let them invent versions of you that fit their story better. You don't need to correct it, because your truth is not a rumor. It is an exile, and the longer you stay explaining, the more you exile yourself from your own becoming. So go. Go without the final paragraph, go without the clean bow, go without the performance, and let your absence say everything your presence tried to explain, and not as a ghost, but as a god, one who leaves not to escape, but to finally return to themselves. Because the truth is, when you disappear from the dynamic, you don't vanish into nothing, you reappear somewhere else, in your own mind without echoes of distortion, in your own skin without shrinking to stay tolerated, in a silence that doesn't suffocate but soothes. The space you leave behind may echo with slander, but the space you step into, it breathes with truth, and truth doesn't beg, it doesn't plead to be softened, it doesn't twist itself into shapes that someone else calls palatable. It just stands there, cold, still, absolute. And that is where you now stand. Not in the storm of someone else's misunderstanding, but in the unshakable knowing that you do not owe your soul to someone else's comfort. You don't need to clarify your tone when your boundaries are crossed. You don't need to translate your needs into pretty metaphors just to be treated with dignity. You don't need to earn peace through perfect phrasing. You only need to leave when the room no longer sees you, but still demands a performance. And that's the real freedom. Not walking away in bitterness, but walking away with nothing left to prove. Silence is a language. Use it like a weapon. There's a kind of silence that feels like surrender, awkward, passive, broken. The kind of silence that trembles, that hopes someone will fill it with kindness. That version of silence is what they expect from you, but there's another kind. A silence forged in fire. And when you learn how to wield it, it becomes the most powerful language you'll ever speak. Because silence is not emptiness, it's strategy. In a world obsessed with noise, with proving, correcting, defending, silence unsettles. It breaks the rhythm of manipulation. It removes the reaction they depend on to stay in control. When you stop responding, they lose their script. When you don't play the role they cast for you, the scene collapses. And this silence, it speaks in volumes. It says, I've seen through this. It says, you're not owed another word. It says, your confusion is no longer my concern. That kind of silence burns cleaner than any argument ever could, because what do manipulators fear most? The moment they can no longer provoke a response, the moment you go still, the moment you don't flinch, don't explain, don't react, the moment your absence starts speaking louder than your defense ever did, you become unreadable, and in doing so, untouchable. It's not that you're ignoring them, you're cutting off the supply, you're refusing to participate in the drama, you're letting the echo of their own words bounce around without interference. And in that vacuum, something strange happens. Their mask begins to slip. Without your energy to feed on, they scramble, they poke, they prod, they provoke harder, because now they need you, not for connection, but for contrast. And when they don't get it, they shrink, they expose themselves. Silence becomes the scalpel that peels back the performance. And here's the deeper truth. Silence is not always absence. Sometimes it is presence intensified. It is everything you would have said, concentrated into a calm that cannot be manipulated. It is the refusal to let someone else's chaos rewrite your character. Nietzsche once wrote, "Those who were seen dancing were thought to be insane by those who could not hear the music." When you speak in silence, only those attuned to self-mastery will understand. The rest will call you cold, uncaring, difficult. Let them. Because silence isn't cruelty, it's clarity. And in a world addicted to reaction, your refusal to perform is rebellion. People will say you should speak up, defend yourself, explain, make them understand. But here's the truth. Silence isn't weakness when it comes from choice. It's the ultimate refusal to be drawn back into chaos that never intended to hear you anyway. Some truths are too sacred to say twice. Some wounds are too deep to narrate to people who treat your pain like a puzzle. Some dignity is preserved only in stillness. And the most powerful line you'll ever say in a toxic dynamic is the one you never speak aloud. Because silence, when it is chosen, is not the end of the conversation. It's the declaration that the conversation is beneath you. So the next time they try to bait you with a smirk, a sigh, a false accusation, masked as concern, don't give them your voice. Give them the weight of your stillness, the weight of someone who no longer negotiates their peace, the weight of someone who knows when words are used to wound, silence becomes the sword. Silence is a language. Use it like a weapon. There's a kind of silence that feels like surrender, awkward, passive, broken, the kind of silence that trembles and hopes someone will fill it with kindness. That's the silence they expect from you, the silence of someone small. But there is another kind, forged in clarity and rage, a silence that comes not from fear, but from the refusal to be played with, a silence that is not emptiness, but weapon, because silence is not the absence of power, it's what power looks like once it has nothing left to prove. In a world built on noise, on reactions, on explaining and defending and repeating yourself to death, silence cuts through like a blade. It severs the cycle, it collapses the scene, it forces the manipulator to sit in their own performance without your applause. They can't play their game without your lines. They can't twist your meaning if you give them no words to work with. They can't misquote your breath. Silence breaks the rhythm they depend on. They prod and poke, waiting for you to snap. When you don't, they spiral. They search for new angles, new triggers, new ways to bait you back in. But all they're met with is stillness, and in that stillness, their mask begins to slip. That's the power of silence. It doesn't just protect you, it reveals them, and it speaks loudly. It says, I've seen this before. It says, you no longer have access. It says, your chaos doesn't belong in my peace. And what it never says, and what it never needs to say, is goodbye, because your withdrawal already screamed it. Silence removes their favorite tool, control over your emotions. When you stop reacting, they lose their leverage. You become unreadable, and in that unreadability, you become untouchable. Let them misinterpret. Let them rewrite the story. Let them sit with the discomfort of not knowing where they stand. That's not your burden anymore. That's the cost of mishandling someone who once spoke with love and now says nothing, because silence is not withdrawal, it's declaration. And if you've ever felt guilty for going quiet, understand this: that guilt was never yours. It was projected by people who needed your voice to validate their version of reality. They weren't listening to understand. They were listening to respond, to win, to redirect. You didn't stop speaking because you were weak. You stopped because you finally understood that conversation was never the goal. The goal was control, and silence is the one response they can't hijack, reshape, or weaponize. When silence is chosen, or when it's intentional, it is the loudest form of truth. It says, "I have nothing more to give you and nothing left I need from you." It says, "I am no longer available to be misunderstood," and it leaves them in a vacuum, one they can't fill, no matter how loud they get. They'll call you cold, they'll call you distant, they'll say you're impossible to talk to. Let them. Your silence is not for their comfort. It's for your clarity. Some truths are too sacred to say twice. Some dignity is preserved only in stillness. And the most powerful line you'll ever speak in a toxic dynamic is the one you never say. Because silence, when it's chosen, isn't the end of a conversation. It's the end of a performance. It's when the actor steps off the stage, unbothered by whether the audience claps. And when you stop performing, they start unraveling. Not because you hurt them, but because you stopped giving them the script, and in the stillness that follows, they're left alone, with themselves, with their reflection, with the haunting realization that you didn't leave because you were fragile. You left because you finally saw through the illusion. In the next section, we explore that final devastating truth. Not that they misunderstood you, but that they chose to, because if they truly wanted to understand, they would have. Some wounds don't come from being misunderstood. They come from realizing you were never meant to be understood in the first place. Not by them, not by the person who looked you in the eye, nodded at your pain, and still twisted your words into something easier for them to dismiss. Not by the friend who always needed more context before they could offer compassion. Not by the parent who heard your voice break and called it dramatic. Not by the partner who asked what was wrong just to use your answer against you later, because the cruelest betrayal isn't silence, it's being heard and still not believed. And that's the truth most people aren't ready to face. They heard you, they just didn't care to understand. They didn't forget what you said. They ignored what it meant. They minimized it, not because they were incapable of comprehension, but because your truth disrupted their comfort. Because understanding you would have required one thing they were never willing to give: accountability. To understand you would have meant admitting that they hurt you, that they dismissed you, that they made you small when you were already crumbling inside. So instead of facing that truth, they chose a more convenient story. They said you were too sensitive, too complicated, too much, hard to love, impossible to please, because in that version of the story, they don't have to change. And you begin to doubt your memory. You question your tone. You try softer, quieter, slower. You don't become easier to love. You become easier to ignore, because that's the point. They were never trying to understand you. They were trying to manage you, control the version of you that stayed in their comfort zone, even if it meant watching you suffocate quietly inside yourself. And that's what makes this realization so heavy, so bitter, because once you see it, you can't unsee it. You replay the moments, the cries for help disguised as conversations, the vulnerability turned into ammunition, the way they nodded at your pain with empty eyes, how they said, "I understand," just enough times to keep you hoping, but never enough to make it true. And you begin to realize it wasn't a miscommunication, it was a strategy. Understanding wasn't something they failed to do, it was something they actively avoided, because if they understood you truly, deeply, without distortion, they'd have to admit what they did, and that would destroy the image they built of themselves. So they chose the easier path. They chose to misunderstand you, to frame you as the problem, to accuse you of overthinking, to use your intelligence against you, your insight as proof you were paranoid, your sensitivity as evidence that you were weak. But you were never the problem. You were the mirror. And they hated what they saw when they looked too closely, because understanding. You would have shattered the false version of themselves they needed to survive, the version where they're always the good one, the calm one, the victim of your overreactions. So they turned your truth into noise and called your silence immature. And when you finally stopped explaining, when you finally walked away, they told others you were cold, distant, hard-hearted, unwilling to grow. But the truth? You grew past them. You outgrew the need to be explained, to be decoded, to be made palatable for someone else's limitations. Because the truth is, if they wanted to understand you, they would have sat with the discomfort of your pain until it made sense to them. They would have listened, not just with their ears, but with their heart. They would have asked, not "Why are you like this?" but "What have you been through?" And they would have stayed long enough to hear the answer. But they didn't, not because you were too hard to understand, but because it was easier for them to pretend you were the villain than admit they were never capable of being the hero. You were never too much. They were just too small. They called you too much, too intense, too sensitive, too deep. And for a while, you believed them. So you quieted your voice, softened your edges, dimmed your light. You thought if you were smaller, they'd finally stay. But no matter how much you shrank, they still found a reason to pull away. Because the truth is, you weren't overwhelming. You were revealing. Your presence demanded honesty. Your words stirred things they tried to keep buried. You brought light to their shadows, and they resented you for it. Not because you were wrong, but because you made it harder for them to pretend. They didn't want your depth. They wanted your silence, because your intensity held up a mirror, and they couldn't bear what they saw in it. You were never too much. They were too small to handle real love, too small to sit in truth, too small to grow. And that's not your fault, so stop apologizing for your fire. Stop translating your soul into smaller sentences just to fit into someone else's comfort zone. You don't need to be less. You need to be you, fully, boldly, unfiltered, because the right people won't be afraid of your fullness. They'll rise to meet it. When you stopped needing them, they couldn't control you anymore. They didn't walk away because you changed. They walked away because you stopped needing them to stay. For a long time, they held power, not through force, but through subtle emotional economics. They gave affection like currency, withheld it like punishment. Every time you reached for them, you gave them leverage. And they used it, gently, quietly, strategically. As long as you needed their approval, they could rewrite your reality. One raised eyebrow could shrink you. One dismissive word could fracture your confidence. They didn't have to control you directly, they just had to keep you needing something from them. But one day, something broke. Not loudly, not with a scream. It cracked in the quiet places, in the pause between texts. In the space where your needs used to beg for recognition, you began to see the game. You began to reclaim your breath. And when you did, everything changed. You stopped defending. You stopped over-explaining. You stopped hoping they'd understand. You simply released, not out of anger, not out of hate, but out of realization. You don't need someone to validate what you already know is true. And that's when their control unraveled, because control doesn't survive where there is no dependence. They couldn't bait you anymore, couldn't trigger you with silence, couldn't manipulate your need for closeness, because you found closeness in yourself. You didn't become colder, you became clearer. You didn't harden, you just stopped handing them the remote to your peace. And once you no longer needed them, they had nothing left to hold over you. That's not abandonment, that's liberation. You didn't let go because you stopped caring. You let go because you finally did. Letting go is misunderstood. They think it means you gave up, that you stopped caring, that you became cold, detached, distant. But the truth is often the opposite. You didn't let go because you felt nothing. You let go because you finally felt everything, fully, painfully, truthfully, and realized that staying was no longer an act of love. It was an act of self-betrayal. You didn't walk away with dry eyes and a hardened heart. You walked away with every part of you trembling. Not because you wanted to, but because you had to. Because holding on was starting to cost you pieces of yourself you could no longer afford to lose. You cared, you tried, you stayed through the confusion, the hurt, the silence. You explained when it hurt. You softened when it didn't work. You bent until you were unrecognizable. And still, it was never enough. But at some point, love stops being a bridge and starts becoming a cage. And so you let go, not because you stopped loving them, but because you finally started loving yourself. You let go, not in anger, but in reverence, for the person you were, for the lessons you learned, for the version of you that stayed too long, hoping. Letting go wasn't weakness. It was your greatest act of strength, because this time, you didn't walk away to punish them. You walked away to protect you. So if this spoke to something buried deep inside you, and if you saw your own story reflected between the lines, don't let it end here. This was only one chapter. There are more truths to uncover, more illusions to break, more power to reclaim, one silent realization at a time. So stay close, subscribe, not just to a channel, but to the quiet revolution happening within you. Because next time, we won't just talk about letting go, we'll talk about rising,